welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. In this edition, we're going to discuss an issue that first came center stage in June 2016 and since then has never quite disappeared from the news pages. We're going to try and take stock of Brexit, short for Britain's decision to exit the European Union in the run-up to the vote in the British Parliament, now scheduled for the week of January 14, 2019. What's the fuss all about, and does it really matter one way or the other to us in India particularly? And to help me do that, I have with me a panel of experts. Mythili Bhusnurmath, formerly India's High Commissioner to the UK and to the EU, who is uniquely qualified to discuss the intricacies of Brexit, and international trade expert R.V. Anuradha, partner and co-founder Claris Law Associates. Welcome to the show, Mythili and Anuradha. Mythili, before we discuss Brexit and its implications for India, for the benefit of our viewers, can you briefly explain what breakfast is all about? We'll go into the details a little later in the discussion, but to start with, can you just bring our viewers up to speed on Brexit? Mythili?
Situation is complicated by the fact that perhaps the European Union went in for an expansion of its membership too soon by bringing in the East European countries, and to that extent, certain people in England, I would say, because Scotland voted to remain within the EU, certain people, a certain percentage of the population in Northern England feel left out of the economy to the extent that the percentage of people who are unemployed is much higher in Northern England. Now, the voting, as you know, was 52% for Brexit and 48% wanted to remain. The situation is somewhat different as far as the House of Commons is concerned. I understand from media reports that 75% of the, I think it's about 650 MPs in the House of Commons, want to remain. And it's further complicated by the fact that within the Conservative Party, there are differences of opinion. As you know, there was recently a vote of confidence which Theresa May won, but about 100 MPs voted against her. She withdrew from the vote that she wanted to have in the House of Commons probably because she was worried that she's going to lose that vote. Now, I'll stop here because I've already spoken quite a bit, because I'm sure you want to ask more questions, that the UK can revoke its invocation of Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. That's what the European Court of Justice ruled, if I remember right, on the 10th of December, very recently. And the Bank of England did a study saying that if the UK exits from the EU with no deal, then it is likely that UK GDP would come down by as much as 8 or 9% in the next 5 years up to 2023. So to sum it all up, I think the intelligentsia and those who are toting up the numbers are convinced that this is a very bad idea. But politically, and good politics is not necessarily good economics. So that's where the situation is right now.
Absolutely. Would you like to add to that, Anuradha? In fact, many would argue that the UK actually had the best of both worlds. Under the earlier system, it was not part of the euro, even while being part of the EU. It had its own passport checks and received a large budget rebate, and yet opted to exit, even though most reports show that the economy would actually be adversely impacted by an exit. So why did the UK vote the way it did?
Well, I think just picking up from what Mythili just explained in terms of the nitty-gritties of what Brexit is all about, I think perhaps the reason for this fairly unprecedented time in history that we are facing, where a country is almost moving towards a nail-biting finish. We have this March 29th deadline, which, as Mythili briefly explained, was triggered by what UK voluntarily triggered, perhaps prematurely, in March 2017 under Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. And that gave it a 2-year period within which to negotiate a deal and exit out of the EU. And the way things have unraveled subsequently, it appears that the entire chaos and the entire disagreement and angst within the UK has been rooted primarily on the immigration-related issue, the free movement of people, as Gemini was explaining. Whereas there have been concerns on perhaps the EU imposing its own regulatory framework on common harmonized regulations, etc. But trade in goods, trade in investment-related aspects have been far less contentious because they are far less palpable for the common person. And it's really in terms of the unemployment-related issues, the labor unrest-related issues, that the entire focus of the debate has been so much on the immigration aspect. And then without having perhaps fathomed the magnitude, the implications, and rushing ahead with what was perhaps envisaged as 2 years is sufficient to hammer out a good deal. But we are sitting here 3 months to the deadline, and there is, again, as Gemini explained, fair amount of disagreement within the parliament itself, and absolutely no clarity in terms of how things are going to unravel, and which is here where the ECJ's decision that UK can actually revoke and go back to where it was prior to the referendum assumes tremendous significance. And there has been a bit of wishful thinking that would this mean that there could be that UK actually revokes it pursuant to perhaps a second referendum, or would it be that UK crashes out? And you would have read news reports over the past couple of days that Prime Minister May is actually preparing for the second eventuality in terms of deploying forces to deal with a no deal Brexit. So to that extent, I think what we are witnessing here is a fair amount of uncertainty, fair amount of chaos.
So chaos, uncertainty, that is the order of the day, which brings me to my next question, Germany, that other than the UK and to a lesser extent the EU, does Brexit really matter at all to a country like India or even to the larger global economy? After all, the UK is no longer the economic powerhouse that it once was. The days of rule Britannia, rule the waves are long over, and the EU is in fact a much larger trade partner for India than the UK. So does it matter at all what kind of deal the UK strikes with the EU, or even whether it strikes a deal at all, Germany, for us in India?
For us in India, it matters to the extent that there will be a loss of growth, not just for UK. I mentioned the numbers that the Bank of England has put out, but even for the EU, it's very, very complicated, the separation. And the sense I'm getting from the odd article in The Guardian or The Economist and so on, because one only has access now to the media, is that the EU would somehow like to retain UK. Now, your question was focused on what does it mean for India. Directly for India, it doesn't mean all that much because our trade with the European countries will continue, and so will it with UK. It's more between UK and EU. But to the extent that economic activity in the UK and the EU, I'll just give you a small example. You'll say, how will economic activity in the EU be affected? If you look at financial services, something which I know a little more about, the London Clearing House or the London Metals Exchange, these are both the largest in the world, including whatever New York has. And to the extent that economic activity in the rest of the EU depends on efficient services in the financial sector, growth in the EU, in the rest of the EU, will also be affected. To that extent, one engine of growth in the world is affected, and to that extent, India is affected. But I would say that in direct trade terms, it is not. It's more the overall impact of a slowing Europe post-Brexit, which will be extremely complicated. Just even for goods, the UK wants free movement of goods. But there is VAT. They have integrated so much in the last so many years that disentanglement, and I'm told that the EU is quite clear that whatever happens, whatever form of Brexit, the Theresa May deal, which I think is dead in the water, I don't think that's going through, but whatever happens, they will have something like a 20-month to a 30-month period over which they will gradually work out the separation. So that's my long answer to your short question. What will happen to our relationship with the EU and UK?
Nothing really is very simple about Brexit, that is true. But Anuradha, doesn't the public angst that led to Brexit strike at the very heart of what ails trade deals the world over? The willingness of countries to go along with free movement of capital, but not of people. In the UK, for instance, wasn't it essentially a backlash against people from Eastern Europe moving to UK for jobs that perhaps the average Britisher was not willing to do? But could India perhaps be a beneficiary? Because I understand the UK government is bringing out a white paper that effectively does away with the preferential treatment of EU citizens and effectively looks only at skills. Now that should be good news for India, shouldn't it?
Well, I would look at it with a little bit of skepticism in terms of how much does it really mean as benefit for India. On the one hand, yes, you're absolutely right that and I agree that the trigger for the entire separation from the EU has been the job losses, the immigration-related issue. But having said that, it is also it's also a fact that the EU, that UK has been actually strengthening its immigration controls over the past 2 years. Ever since what's called the Migration Advisory Committee came out with its review and strengthening of controls over movement of people from non-EU countries, which has been impacting India for the last 2 years, more in terms of higher salary thresholds, a fair amount of rigor in terms of entry of professionals. There is something called an immigration skills surcharge, which every business has to pay to bring in a foreigner, and that surcharge would actually be used for a fund to train UK professionals. So there has been a lot of movement on that front that's been happening. What is going to change is that EU professionals are not going to have it any easier. Theresa May has made it extremely clear that this is going to be the end of the free movement for EU citizens. But that doesn't mean that it's going to become easier for Indians. It just means that there's going to be level playing field between Indians and other EU citizens. To that extent, would it mean marginally higher access? Perhaps for high-skilled labor, as you mentioned, the focus of the new white paper has been on focusing on entry for high-skilled professionals and ending quotas for nurses, for example, and other sectors where the UK has a demand for foreign professionals. But it certainly does not mean that it will automatically mean certainty for entry of professionals, because at the heart of the entire debate throughout the world has also been far more fractured societies, far more insular economies that are turning very skeptical to free movement of people.
In fact, it might work to our disadvantage. It could cut both ways, because we might end up losing our high-skilled labor. But I'm afraid it's time for us to slip into a very short break. Please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and I'm in discussion with Joymini Bhagwati and R.V. Anuradha, trying to make sense of Brexit, and particularly what does it mean for India? Does it mean anything at all? Joymini, do you see this vote as part of the global backlash against globalization? Also, the fact is the UK may no longer be a major trading power. But as you mentioned, London's prominence as a global financial hub has enabled many Indian companies to raise money in that market. It is estimated that almost 80% of the masala bonds issued by Indian companies were issued in London. Of course, the total quantum of masala bonds is still quite small, but there is no denying the importance of London when it comes to global finance. Do you see that diminish regardless of the terms that UK negotiates with the EU? Joymini?
I think that has already started happening, because you think about yourself working in JP Morgan or whatever, one of these large banks which also have substantial investment banking activities. They have already started preparing for some form of Brexit, because they can't allow this to hit them in a way in which they are unprepared. Now, your question also had something to do with India and masala bonds and so on. Yes, I think that will continue. London will, in whatever shape or form this Brexit happens or does not happen, if there is a referendum and a large proportion of the people now vote to stay within the EU, I think London will continue to be an important financial center. There's just something in the way the UK is set up as a country to attract capital, and that's all to do with taxes and so on, and also to make it easy for international professionals to work there. So to that extent, it's all very good. I don't see a huge change. Yes, what will happen is that some masala bonds may no longer be issued out of London, but out of Frankfurt. The professionals will move and the services will still be provided. Will they be provided at the same cost? Perhaps not, because as I said, when you have this level of disturbance within an economic unit, EU as it's constituted now, not after UK leaves, is about $18 trillion in size. So that is a very substantial number. That is second only to the US, and that too only marginally. I think the latest numbers for US is 19 trillion. So if you have disturbances in an economy of that size, I think there will be some problems, both for the real sectors that interact between India and Europe and the financial sectors.
But rather, you spoke about investment, and the fact is, when it comes to investment, India is one of the largest investors in the UK rather than the other way around, with Indian companies investing largely in the UK, much more than the UK invests in India. So will Brexit change things? Will it make UK less attractive for Indian companies?
Well, to the extent that the location of UK was primarily to access the rest of the EU market, practically all companies, whether Indian or other global companies, would certainly get impacted in terms of reorienting their approach towards the type of businesses that they are accessing. A lot, again, as I said, remains a little uncertain because it will probably also depend on the type of deal, and hopefully there will be a deal before Brexit actually fructifies, or that no Brexit really happens. But there is, I think, still a little bout of uncertainty in terms of whether UK would still make sense or be as attractive for Indian investors if it were to be a no-deal Brexit.
Absolutely. In fact, Germany, the UK is scheduled to leave at 11 p.m. UK time on Friday, 29 March 2019. And though it can be extended if all 28 EU members agree, there is a view that that agreement is not essential. What is your reading of the situation? Also, Theresa May has been warning that no deal would be far worse than a less than perfect deal that she is negotiating. But from the perspective of India, does it make a difference whether it is no deal or Theresa May's deal, Germany?
I think from the perspective of India, a no deal is worse, because the no deal will mean much more harm for the UK and to a much lower extent also for the EU. But as I mentioned earlier, the Theresa May deal is not happening. It's just not happening. Doesn't matter which way you cut and splice or dice those 650 MPs. And of course, you can never say never about anything. But she is already talking about a revised deal. Theresa May visited Brussels recently, and I think the EU is prepared to make some small adjustments. But the problems are humongous. Time is short, so one can't get into the Northern Ireland backstop issue, the Good Friday Agreement, and so on and so forth, the Norway model. There are so many issues that have been discussed again and again and again, and my sense is that a substantial number of the House of Commons MPs will vote against a Theresa May deal, even if it is tweaked a bit. So it is all mixed up with internal politics in the UK. And as far as India is concerned, to come back to your question, it is a bad or an even worse situation, but at a margin, because there's the rest of the world and life will go on. So, and the UK will try to figure out something with us in terms of a free trade agreement and so on. But that's going to be very complicated, because there'll be a transition period over which a number of the agreements that the UK has agreed to with EU will have to be disentangled. And both sides have agreed that that may take anything from 2 to 3 years.
Oh yes, indeed. In fact, as you mentioned, Germany, life will very much be the same for the rest of the world. In fact, Arunada, would you agree that actually the UK is the biggest loser? Because regardless of what terms the UK actually manages to negotiate, and for now the EU has ruled out any renegotiation, the UK will really lose the kind of access to the single EU market that it had before. And what does this mean for global supply chains? Will they be impacted, Anuradha?
Again, clearly yes, and that also leads back to the issue of why did things unravel the way they have, and why wasn't there better strategic planning and anticipating the type of transitions, or even the terms under which the Brexit should really happen. So when people really voted for Remain or Brexit, at that point of time, I don't think there was any understanding at all of the consequences that were to follow.
Oh, indeed. I think a lot of times the people vote and then realize what it means much later. But Germany, what does this mean really for the Indo-EU free trade agreement that I think you were also involved in the negotiations? It's been going on for almost forever, 11 years if I understand right. So does this change things, and will we negotiate a separate FTA now with the EU minus UK and then another one with the UK? What is your sense, Germany?
Yeah, you see, one of the issues on which we were stuck was the free movement of professionals, or at least freer movement of professionals, and particularly for IT professionals, because they are highly competitive, as we know, globally. And the UK there was at the forefront of saying that, India does not quite comply with their understanding and their standards of data security. Now, will the EU without UK be a little more relaxed about this issue? Because on data security, India and the US have come to an agreement, and therefore an understanding. Therefore, there is no problem on that score with the US. If the US finds our data security acceptable, it is a little difficult to understand why UK was doing this, except to extract concessions from India on that free trade agreement. My recollection, and I don't think much has happened since then, that there are offensive and defensive interests, and by that I mean, the car industry over there has both offensive and defensive interests. Germany is very comfortable that it's luxury cars. They don't need to worry about competitiveness, but SEAT, which is the Fiat of Italy, which is called SEAT in Spain, they have worries about Maruti Suzuki flooding European markets. I'm just giving two examples, one from the auto industry and one from services, particularly financial services, where our companies such as TCS and Wipro and Infosys and so on are highly competitive, and they already have a number of people in Europe, and they would like easier movement of those professionals. Now, I don't see that becoming much easier just because UK has left and because they were the ones who were at the forefront of data security. Because I think you alluded to it, Mythili, right at the beginning, that this whole issue of Brexit is because there has been a churning of the global economy, where it is moving in a direction in which developed countries are worried that their primacy and their supremacy in some ways is being challenged by countries.
Okay. And rather, would you agree with Germany when he says the crux of the issue is really that the West is worried about the fact that their clout is coming down and emerging markets like India are becoming increasingly important, that the world order is changing? And rather?
Well, to a large extent, I do agree with that, and we do witness that both in terms of higher barriers for movement of persons, but increasingly also increasing scrutiny of type of capital, origin of capital that is actually moving across borders. That's also happening. But in terms of just going back to the bottlenecks on data protection, as well as the movement of persons-related issue vis-a-vis EU and whether it's going to become easier with UK, I think the underlying aspect also is that UK currently has a law implementing the EU's GDPR, which is the revised version of the Data Protection Directive. So to that extent, the letter of the law in UK today is as stringent as it was in the EU, and India, as you know, is also moving towards a fairly strong data protection framework, but legislation on that is yet to materialize. So if again Brexit were to happen and India were to negotiate separately with the UK, would it have it easier on data protection? I think the devil will lie in the details in terms of the type of concessions, the type of adequacy status India is able to negotiate, which it might actually be able to do even with the EU, in view of the fact that it might also have a fairly elaborate protection of data, which has been EU's main concern.
Well, yes, that's true. The devil is always in the detail, but I'm afraid we've run out of time completely. So I have to end this discussion now. Thank you so much, Germany and Anuradha, for joining me and trying to clear some of the fog around Brexit. Clearly, by and large, if you agree with me, I think the view is that Brexit is a bit like the British monarchy. Only the British are fascinated by it. The rest of the world has only passing interest. And hopefully, it will not affect us any more than the British monarchy affects us now. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.